Well, I was about to start introducing three speakers, two of them well known to the Society, and one of them needs to be well known because of her work on the Society, not just in, but on the Society. Angus Nichols, based in London, who is an intellectual historian, basically worked on Blumenberg, most recently on Max Müller, that big event that he more or less organized. And he is talking about diplomacy, competition and crisis, the English Goethe Society 1886 to 1914. And along with him, collaborating in that, I don't know whether they're going to be a chorus or one in succession to the other, Fabienne Schopp from Stuttgart, who actually did her master's degree thesis on our archives, working from our archives. I think it's rather a fine extra accolade for a society that its archives become used by other scholars. So she's very welcome to join us today. And the third speaker is Dan Wilson, from whom we've already been hearing in administrative matters. Challenges for the English Goethe Society, 1923, 1945, H.G. Fiedler, L.A. Willoughby, W. Rose. Dan is well known, of course, to members of the Society and to anybody in the Goethe world for books on Goethe, often regarded by orthodox Goethe people as very challenging and rather fiery. And Dan, of course, as we know, is the most charming and mild of people, not at all aggressive, but he has ruffled feathers occasionally in the English Goethe Society, in the German Goethe Society rather. His most recent book, of course, is a history of the Weimar Goethe Society in its dealings, not always entirely reputable, as you can imagine, with Nazism. So without further ado, I would ask Angus and Fabienne to launch into the first topic.
Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity to be part of this anniversary symposium. At the beginning, I'd like to say that the original research behind our presentation is far more Fabienne's work than it is mine. As you just heard from Jim, Fabienne wrote her master's dissertation at the University of Stuttgart, actually when I was there as a Humboldt Fellow about 8 years ago. And her topic was Die Anfänge der English Goethe Society. She was co-supervised by Sandra Richter and myself. And Fabienne is going to have more to say on the subject of competition and crisis between the years of 1886 and 1914, while my theme is diplomacy. It's perhaps difficult for us to imagine today that the English Goethe Society might originally have had a serious diplomatic purpose. In order to appreciate this, we might recall what the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called the literary field and its position within the field of power. He says a number of the practices and representations of artists and writers can only be explained by reference to the field of power, inside of which the literary field is itself in a dominated position. The field of power is the space of relations of force between agents or between institutions having in common the possession of the capital necessary to occupy the dominant positions in different fields, notably economic or cultural. So the field of power simply refers to the field in which various forms of capital, both economic and cultural, vie for predominance. And Bourdieu thinks that literature is generally in the position of being dominated within the overall field of power because its links to economic capital are comparatively weak in comparison to, say, the banking industry. What remains, therefore, is the possibility that the literary field may gain some sway within the overall field of power by virtue of its cultural capital, which in political terms might be called soft power. I'm going to return to Bourdieu later on when I use another of his key terms, that of habitus, to describe the career of Max Müller, the first president of the English Goethe Society. But for now, I'm sure it won't surprise you when I say that my thesis in this short talk is that the cultural capital exerted by the literary field was probably stronger during the late 19th century than it is today. The The model for this, which precedes the establishment of the English Goethe Society, is the Deutsche Shakespeare-Gesellschaft in Weimar. Established in 1864 on the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth, the Shakespeare-Gesellschaft is the oldest literary society in Germany. The society did have a base in industrial capital, since its founder, Wilhelm Oechelhäuser, was an industrialist and director of the Deutsche Kontinentalgasgesellschaft, responsible for supplying gas to German cities. This industrial capital notwithstanding, I think we can claim that the cultural capital embodied in the figure of Shakespeare in Germany far exceeded that held by Goethe in Britain during the same period. Shakespeare in Germany is, of course, a huge and separate topic, and I won't go into that topic here. But I think the difference lies in the fact that, beginning with Herder's and Goethe's Shakespeare idolatry of the 1770s, Shakespeare functioned as an important model for German literary authors in a way that Goethe probably did not in Britain. The subsequent Schlegeltique translations and their influence on the German theatre are, of course, of a completely different order to any influence exerted by Goethe on Anglophone culture. Maybe we can talk about that later on. So I want to suggest here that the conditions that at least indirectly gave rise to the Goethe Society in Britain were quite different to those of the Deutsche Shakespeare-Gesellschaft. And I think they have to do with power of different kind, namely British imperial power on the global stage. This book, co-edited by John Davis, with whom I did the special issue of Pegs on Max Müller, Stefan Manz and Margret Schulte-Bierbuhl, sets out the context very nicely. One of its main arguments is that the British Empire was part of a larger European imperial project in which Germans were always involved economically, culturally, and scientifically. London in particular held a significant attractiveness for German bankers and industrialists, as did Manchester, and we'll hear about Manchester in Fabienne's talk. On the level of culture, and particularly within the academy, there were mutual interests that saw Germans migrate to Britain during the middle to late 19th century. Now, some of these migrants, including important early members of the Goethe Society, were political refugees from the 1848 attempted revolutions in Germany. Eugene or Eugen Oswald is one of these, whose Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry is written by John Flood, who I think is here today. He is a case in point. He was a democratically inclined journalist for the Mannheimer Abendzeitung, and he arrived at Dover in 1852 after periods of exile in Metz, Paris, and Brussels during the late 1840s. He later became first instructor of German at the Royal Navy College in Greenwich, and also tutor in German to some members of the royal family. And he was secretary of the EGS from 1891 until his death in 1912. The strength and reach of the British Empire do not explain the presence of migrants like Oswald, rather it's British political liberalism that does. But for other important figures in the early history of the Goethe Society, empire was certainly the predominant context for their business and cultural activities. Apart from Max Müller himself, who I will turn to later, probably the most prominent example of this is Nikolaus Trübner. Trübner's CV before coming to Britain shows the depth of his training in the publishing trade in Germany with publishers that still exist today. A partnership with the publisher William Longman saw him move to London in 1843. We don't know exactly why Trübner came to London, but I think it's likely that he was attracted by the global trade in books in English. Trübner then set up his own publishing house at Ludgate Hill in 1851, and it was eventually merged with Keegan, Paul, Trench & Co. in 1883, and finally with Routledge, our current imprint for Pegs, in 1912. Now, the imperial context here is that Trübner's specialism was Orientalism, especially books on Asian literatures and religions, including popular translations of religious texts. His most successful brand was Trübner's Oriental series, which lasted for some 50 years. So on this slide, you can see the first edition in that series, which was in 1878, and it's a book on Indian literature by the German Indologist Albrecht Weber. This edition from 1930 shows other works in the series. So Trübner was really the leading publisher of Orientalist books in Britain. He died in 1884, 2 years before the foundation of the EGS. So how is he relevant to our story? Well, it's complicated. The foundation of the English Goethe Society was partly at the instigation of David Nutt, a publisher on the Strand who had specialised in foreign books for decades. This announcement from the weekly journal The Academy declares the intention to establish an English Goethe Society, and the establishment of a Shelley Society is actually mentioned in the same article. Interested parties are asked to contact David Nutt at 270 The Strand. Now, there's no Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry on David Nutt, but I have been able to establish that the firm was publishing at least as far back as 1812 with an edition of Plutarch. That's the oldest text that I found. The firm specialised in foreign language books, both in the original languages and in translation, including many titles by Goethe. And Nutt, of course, was also publisher of Pegs from 1886 until 1909. So here we can see an 1841 edition of Faust translated into English verse, and then alongside it an 1862 German edition of Faust, both published by Nutt. Now, the curious thing about David Nutt is the name of his son, Alfred Trübner Nutt. And you will hear more about him in Fabienne's talk. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which I've been using a lot because I can't go to libraries at the moment, attributes Alfred Nutt's middle name to his father David's business partnership with Nicholas Trübner, without saying what the nature of that partnership actually was. But I think the likely arrangement was that Trübner was distributing books published by Nutt. At any rate, the partnership was significant enough for the name Trübner to enter the Nutt family. As you will hear in Fabienne's talk, Alfred Trübner Nutt, perhaps more so than his father, was the key mediating force with the Goethe Gesellschaft in Weimar, and he helped to bring the English Goethe Society into being. His facility in German can be attributed to his having worked as a publisher's apprentice in Berlin and Leipzig, and he was still a young man of 29 years when he began working towards the establishment of the EGS. He later became best known as a publisher and scholar of Celtic folklore, as this edition of Waifs and Strays of Celtic tradition demonstrates. So why have I spent so much time on this trio of Nicholas Trübner, David Nutt, and Alfred Trübner Nutt? The reason why is I think that it provides an important context for the choice of Max Müller as first president of the EGS. And there he is. Now, by our present day standards, Müller was by no means an obvious choice. He wasn't a Goethe scholar, and his main achievements were in the field of Orientalism and what came to be known as comparative philology. He is now chiefly remembered as the founding father of comparative religious studies on account of the 50-volume project, The Sacred Books of the East, a collection of Asian religious texts translated into English. This monumental project involved over 20 translators and outlived Müller himself, with the first volume, pictured here, appearing in 1879, and the final volume in 1910. Müller was an Indo-Germanist in the tradition of Friedrich Schlegel and Franz Bopp, and he studied with Bopp in Berlin. And diplomacy, the theme of my talk, played an important part in Müller's career. It was this man, the Prussian ambassador to London, Christian Charles Josias von Bunsen, who arranged for Müller to come to Britain in 1846 in order to translate the Rig Veda into English. A former student of Schleiermacher, Bunsen was preoccupied with the history of all world religions and with the idea that the same God is expressed in different forms by all world religions. For this reason, he was associated with the higher criticism of David Friedrich Strauss, and therefore regarded with some suspicion by members of the High Church of England. Bunsen elaborated these ideas in English across 7 volumes entitled Christianity and Mankind, and you can see the cover of one of those volumes there. So it was for this reason that Bunsen supported Müller's career and sought to have him installed as the chief translator of the manuscripts of the Rig Veda, which were then in possession of the East India Company in London. For Bunsen, it would be a major diplomatic coup to have a Prussian-educated German translating these Vedas. Müller had studied in Leipzig and notably in the Prussian capital, Berlin, hearing there Schelling's lectures on the philosophy of mythology during the 1840s. Müller's edition of the Vedas was not completed until 1874, by which time he was already Taylor Professor of Modern Languages in Oxford. And his landmark publication was his long essay on comparative mythology of 1856, which compares myths in ancient Greek and Sanskrit, and was reprinted numerous times over 6 decades, as this 1909 edition demonstrates. So the text had a life for 60, 70 years. The essay was one of the key sources on what came to be known as the comparative method in Britain, especially influential for nascent disciplines such as sociology, especially Herbert Spencer, and also anthropology, especially Edward Burnett Tyler. Perhaps Müller's most conspicuous Goethe-Zeit-related achievement was his translation of Kant's First Critique, which appeared in 1881 to mark the centenary of that text. But the 3 central dramas of Müller's career, and they really were dramas, had everything to do with religion and nothing to do with Goethe. The first was Müller's loss to Monia Williams in the election for the Bowden Chair of Sanskrit in Oxford in 1860. Although Müller was probably the best qualified candidate, he lost in that election, in which clergy voted, because of his liberal tastes in matters of religion. And following this rejection, Müller actually threatened to resign. This is a caricature of him that I found in the Bodleian a couple of years ago. The second drama was Müller's public and bitter debate with Charles Darwin on the origin of language, following the publication of The Descent of Man in 1871. Whereas Darwin argued for an evolutionary continuum between animal cries and human language, Müller argued that only human language is articulate and rational, stemming from a priori mental concepts in the manner of Kant. These Kantian arguments saw limited success and actually marked the start of Müller's slow and gradual decline as a public intellectual within Britain. The third drama was this lecture. This is the slide on Darwin that I missed out earlier on. This is Müller replying to Darwin in an article from 1875, so about 4 years after the Descent of Man. The third drama was this particular lecture, the Westminster Lecture on Missions, held at Westminster Abbey in 1873. Here, Müller expanded on Bunsen's ideas about universal religion, which really meant universal monotheism and universal Christianity. Müller advised in this lecture that British missionaries in India should not directly attempt to convert Hindus to Christianity, but rather look to what is common in both religions. He says, whenever two religions are brought into contact, when members of each live together in peace, abstaining from all direct attempts at conversion, it calls out the best elements in each, and at the same time keeps under all that is of doubtful value, of uncertain truth. Whenever this has happened in the history of the world, it has generally led to the reform of both systems or to the foundation of a new religion. Now, this didn't go down well. It didn't go down well in Britain, and it especially didn't go down well in India. For Orthodox Christians in Britain, it was heresy to associate Christianity with Hinduism, and there were protests outside Westminster Abbey when this lecture was delivered. For many Hindus, Max Müller was just another Christian imperialist, but in a more liberal guise. Müller attempted to get around the problem of Hindu polytheism through an idea that he borrowed from Schelling. The doctrine of henotheism held that multiple gods of the Hindu pantheon are really just expressions of one single overarching god to which they are subordinate. The underlying thesis was that the so-called Aryan or Indo-European race had originally been one tribe, worshipping one god associated with the sun. Now, as is well known, this doctrine tended to bypass the Semitic origins of Christianity, while also seeing Europeans as the more advanced branch of the Aryan tree, who must now minister to their more backward Aryan brethren in India. So it was an imperial idea. Muslims in India were, of course, also excluded from this Aryan brotherhood. Now, these ideas were not propagated by Max Müller alone, but he was by far their most famous exponent in the English-speaking world at that time. So why then did the founders of the English Goethe Society settle on Müller? Well, in 1886, he was probably the best-known German intellectual in Britain. In the British context, the choice of Müller would have been a signal that the English Goethe Society was liberal in its theological orientation, a society of the future and not the past. In the 1880s, comparative philology was also a more established and prestigious field than modern languages, partly due to its significance for religion. As I'm sure you know, the first chairs of German in the UK were both in London. Ludwig von Neudenfels at UCL in 1828 and Adolphus Bernays at King's in 1831. On this slide, you see two of their teaching manuals. Oxford then followed in 1845, and Cambridge did not appoint to a full lectureship in German until 1884, a post filled by Karl Breuil, and this later became the Schroeder Chair in 1910. Full degree programs in German were not offered until 1887 at Cambridge and 1903 at Oxford. So in other words, classical philology, and especially Orientalism, still held sway in terms of cultural power during the late 19th century. Owing to their association with Nicholas Trubner, David Nutt and Alfred Trubner Nutt would have been familiar with the prestige of international networks of European Orientalism, which were themselves funded by British imperialism. In Britain, Müller stood at the centre of these networks, and the Nutts may well have witnessed, or at least read about, Müller chairing the so-called Aryan section, you can see the heading there on my slide, of the International Congress of Orientalists in London in 1874, the proceedings of which were published by Trübner, as you can see there on the slide. It was also at this meeting that Max Müller announced the Sacred Books Project, which had significant financial backing from Oxford University Press and very, very high prestige. Added to this was Max Müller's habitus, his cultural capital and his connections, especially but not only in liberal politics at the very highest levels of power. Müller had a copious correspondence with Gladstone from the 1870s onwards. In Bunsen, he also had a mediating link to the royal family, and he gave private lectures on comparative philology to Queen Victoria during the 1860s. The appointment of Max Müller as the first president of the English Goethe Society suggests to us that the Society's orientation and purpose during the 1880s were quite different to what they are today. I think the Society's purpose was perhaps less academic and more cultural and political. The Nuts may also have had a commercial interest in establishing this society, since their publishing house had long published German literature. Müller, moreover, was far less a symbol of Goethe scholarship or of Germanistik than he was a representative of that most German of Wissenschaften, namely Philologie. I will conclude my talk by saying that Müller himself was, at least initially, rather cool on the idea of being the first president of the EGS. In response to the first overture, he wrote, "If I lived in London, nothing would have given me greater pleasure than to act as president of the English Goethe Society. That society ought to exercise a very powerful influence on English thought and draw the two nations, the English and the German, very close together with their common sympathy with Goethe." So as this letter reveals, they had to ask him twice, and he only said yes the second time. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. Angus, does Fabian feel like just picking the thread up and going straight ahead?
Yes, of course.
Yes, as a welcome.
I'll share my screen as well.
Yeah. Yes.
I hope you can see it now. So can you see my screen? Does it work?
We're still seeing the first page of Angus's.
Okay, so then that's fine. That's also mine.
Okay.
Okay. So I will start in the very beginning by showing you how the English Goethe Society was founded and which obstacles they had to overcome during their first 28 years of existence. As Angus Nichols said, the story I'm going to tell is based on the research I did for my master's thesis in 2014, as well as an article which was recently published in the magazine Internationales Archiv der Sozialgeschichte der deutschen Literatur. The archival material is from the Goethe und Schiller Archiv in Weimar and the English Goethe Society's own archive in Senate House Library. You will find a timeline on the bottom of every slide of my presentation with an arrow pointing to the time we are currently in during the narrative. I hope that makes time travel a little easier. Unfortunately, not all pictures shown have a good quality or even a good angle. I took all pictures during my visit in Senate House Library in 2013, and I thought the pictures were only for me to see. I never imagined that I would one day have the opportunity to show my research to an audience. I will often mention the German Goethe Gesellschaft as they played a crucial role during these first years. The Goethe Gesellschaft Weimar, as you may know, was founded in June 1885, so 1 year before the society. The reason was that Goethe's last grandchild, Walter Wolfgang von Goethe, died and that he left the house at the Frauenplan, as well as his grandfather's handwritten legacy to the Grand Duchy of Saxon-Weimar-Eisenach. So this being said, I invite you to travel with me to Victorian London to a day almost exactly 135 years ago, to February 5th, 1886, which was, curiously enough, also a Friday. This was the founding day of the English Goethe Society, and Alfred Trübner-Natt, who you've also already met during Angus Nicholls' contribution, played a major role in the founding of the English Goethe Society, as Trübner-Natt announced in a letter to the German Goethe Gesellschaft. He wrote, Die English Goethe Society als Zweig der Goethe-Gesellschaft ist am verflossenen Freitag, den 5.2., nun wirklich ins Leben gerufen worden und verspricht zu gedeihen. Of course, this did not just happen overnight, but required hard work and skillful negotiations. The very first steps, however, were taken in December 1885, also by Alfred Trübner-Natt. He contacted Freiherr August von Loen, chairman of the executive committee of the Weimar Goethe Gesellschaft. Trübner-Natt wrote to say that Goethe enthusiasts in London wished to form a similar literary society in close connection with Weimar. The Goethe Gesellschaft responded with interest and offered to grant the British the same rights as their German counterparts. This also included the receipt of all German publications in return for a subscription. In the correspondence, the society was referred to as a branch, Zweig in German, and the Goethe Gesellschaft as the parent society. Although this word proposes a certain dependency, the society conducted all its day-to-day business independently of Weimar. The objectives of the newly founded English Goethe Society were stated in its first annual report. I quote, "The society is formed to promote and extend the study of Goethe's work and thought and to encourage original research upon all subjects connected with Goethe." Why, one may wonder, was there such an interest in establishing a Goethe Society in Britain? 3 reasons for this phenomenon can be identified. Firstly, many of the founding members had a prior interest in Goethe, among them professors, translators of Goethe's work, and various other admirers. Secondly, a large number were German emigrants, such as the longtime society secretary Eugene Oswald. I will later show that the Oswald's name is one to remember, as they played an important part in the society's history. The third reason for founding a Goethe Society was the sheer breadth of the poet's interests. As the second president of the society, Edward Dowden, remarked in an address to the society's members. He said, "Goethe required cooperative toil, students of poetry in all its forms, students of criticism, of science, of philosophy, could be happily employed upon his enormous work." End of quote. I will not focus on the structure that the society adopted, but I would like to point out that they introduced basic democratic principles. The membership elected a council of 18, which in turn elected a president and several vice presidents. The first president, as you already know, was Friedrich Max Müller. Almost from the beginning, so-called branches of the English Goethe Society emerged throughout the country. For example, in South London, in North London, and in Manchester. The Manchester branch will also play a very important part later on. The meetings of the branches took place in private houses of individual members. They organized exhibitions, staged plays, and arranged read-throughs of Goethe's texts. The society welcomed the formation of local branches and recognized the more social nature of their gatherings, but it also found itself facing competition from within. I quote, "The meetings of the 2 existing London branches, held by the kindness of individual members at private houses, have been well attended and much appreciated, seeming to point to a demand for the infusion of the social with a purely intellectual element in the proceedings of metropolitan gatherings." End of quote. The English Goethe Society learned from the experience and began to supplement its regular meetings with musical evenings and dinner parties, where there was more scope for socializing. During my research at Zenit House Library, I was kindly invited to a meeting of the English Goethe Society, and I remember there was also time for social gathering with a glass of sherry offered. So the conviviality continues to play a major role until today. The early English Goethe Society continued to cherish very good relations with Weimar. In the archives, many hints can be found for different celebrations to which both societies invited each other over the years. Beside the diplomatic element, these visits were predominantly social occasions. As an example, members of the society traveled to Weimar to participate at the 25th anniversary celebrations of the Weimar Goethe-Gesellschaft in 1910. If we were not amidst a global pandemic, we ourselves might be enjoying an anniversary dinner, just as the members of the English Goethe Society did more than 100 years ago. However, I believe the menu would be different today. When writing the speech, I remembered in the back of my head that I read 7 years ago about quite an exotic dish being served, measured in today's expectations, of course. The society's members who traveled to Weimar were served a very expensive starter, which was nothing out of the ordinary in the long 19th century. As you can see here, it was turtle soup. So not only the food was special, but also the time spent together. One evening, all participants were asked to dress up in costumes of Goethe's time. The drawings of the suggestions made are preserved in the archives. Of course, the festivities play an important part for the social aspect of a membership at the society, but the main focus was on the promotion of Goethe's work. Although the society never adopted a political stance in its statuses, it did have an additional and unofficial agenda: the improvement of relations between the German Empire and Britain. This was not only clear from its close ties with Weimar, but was also regularly addressed in the annual reports. Anglo-German relations were further highlighted in the inaugural lecture by Max Müller, and in 1902, at the time of the Boer War, mention was made of a pamphlet, I quote, advocating for a better understanding between England and Germany, end of quote. Aside from this, the Society's efforts to promote Anglo-German relations at lectures were somewhat discreeter. Members gave talks on German literature to other societies as a means of recruiting new members and raising awareness of the Society and its objectives. Even though the Society had no explicitly political orientation, it was subject to political tensions of the 19th century. The already mentioned Boer Wars and the escalation of the German naval presence to rival British sea power being two prominent examples. Around the turn of the century in particular, the Society reported repeatedly on the harmful repercussions of these developments. I quote, "The public events of the last 2 years have not been favorable to the interests of peaceful literary societies, and ours is not the only one which has felt an adverse influence on that score." End of quote. Actually, it was not until after 1903 that tensions subsided. Throughout this period, however, the Society struggled to attract newcomers and saw a decline in its membership, which had reached between 200 and 270 in the first years. Faced with this situation, the Society urged its members to inspire friends and acquaintances to join. The result was an accordingly homogeneous group of people drawn chiefly from the British upper middle class. The class affiliations of Society members can be deduced from their occupations and careers, which are recorded most notably in the case of prominent figures such as Friedrich Max Müller and Eugene Oswald. 2 members of the royal family also belonged to the Society. Prince Christian von Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Augustenburg, who is a grandson of Schiller's patron Friedrich Christian II. Prince Christian was married to Princess Helena of Great Britain and Ireland, who is the daughter of Queen Victoria. Although the source material suggests that the royal couple never attended a single meeting or had any other influence on the work of the society, the presence of their names nevertheless reflects the family relationship between the British and German royal houses and underlines the political aspect of the society. But not only the political influences of this time had its toll on the English Goethe Society. The relations between the English Goethe Society and the Goethe Gesellschaft were not always harmonious, or even immune from rivalry. In 1891, after suffering further problems, the society drifted into its first crisis, which nearly cost the society its existence. Reflecting on the crisis year in 1901, Eugene Oswald speaks of a general slackness within the society, which led to a break with the Goethe Gesellschaft. The reasons for this slack period were not written about or analyzed at that time. Either this never happened, or no relevant information can be gleaned from the source material. So whatever the cause, January 1891 saw an outbreak of disagreements within the council, accompanied by a steep decline in membership. The letter of invitation to the business meeting scheduled for the end of February 1891 stated that no further nominations to the council could be accepted pending a decision of the society's future. At stake was no less a matter than the society's survival. The questions facing the membership were as follows. 1. Is it desirable that the society should be continued? 2. If yes, is it desirable to widen its scope by including, e.g., the whole of German literature during the classical period? And 3. If yes, what steps should be taken to secure the effective organization of the society financially and otherwise? End of quote. In early May 1891, so just 2 months later, the dissolution of the English Goethe Society was officially proposed and was only averted following an objection by Eugene Oswald and other members. For the time being, a temporary executive committee was appointed to deal with day-to-day business. Even though Oswald and colleagues wished the Goethe Society to continue, they no longer harbored any expectation that a society devoted exclusively to Goethe could survive. Writing in 1911, Hippolyt von Wiegnau, a member of the Goethe Gesellschaft, reflected that the crisis was also partly due to the fact that London, in contrast to Weimar, lacked the gravitational pull of the Goethe National Museum, the Goethe Archives, and also various other memorials to the right. Unfortunately, the Weimar Goethe Gesellschaft too contributed to the worsening of an already precarious situation. Believing reports that the society had been disbanded, it contacted all its English members in June 1891, inviting them to join the German society directly. You can see here the letter which the Goethe Gesellschaft sent to its English members. So the letter from Weimar was a heavy blow for the already weakened society, but the executive committee reacted quickly and cool-headedly by assuring both the English members and the German society that the reports were false. The Goethe Gesellschaft no doubt had both a professional and financial interest in winning over the English members. After all, the numerous Goethe specialists amongst them would have proved a benefit to the German society. And more members would also have meant greater financial reserves at a time when the Goethe Gesellschaft Weimar too was facing a decline in membership. Indeed, it was only through the resurgence of interests on the part of the British dual members that Weimar began to register new growth in 1893. Although friendly relations between London and Weimar quickly resumed after this critical year, the English Goethe Society continued to suffer its repercussions and found itself having to quash rumors of its demise for years to come. The flourishing Manchester branch, which was considered as the main affiliate at the time of its foundation, also caused problems for the English Goethe Society in the crisis year of 1891. In 1888, Manchester recorded more than 100 members and had an honorary secretary, a vice president, and a president. In order to explain all the correlations, I have to make a little excursion. So even before the above mentioned business meeting of February 1891, the English Goethe Society had already launched an attempt to save the society. In short, it was proposed that the seat of the English Goethe Society was transferred to Manchester. And in addition, they already suggested that to include other literary contemporaries of Goethe. This proposal was rejected by Manchester, and relations between the two societies soured during the rest of 1891. And this is where the aforementioned letter from the Goethe-Gesellschaft comes into the picture again. As the Manchester branch did indeed follow the invitation to become full members. This becomes especially visible in the 7th annual report of the Goethe-Gesellschaft from 1891. The two British Goethe societies were now mentioned separately, with the British section of the membership membership directory broken down into the English Goethe Society and the Manchester Goethe Society. What form relations between Manchester and Weimar took is not clear from any of the German annual reports. As far as one can judge from the source material, they were neither bad nor particularly close. However, the Manchester Goethe Society did not exist for long. Although no precise date is given, the dissolution of the society is likely to have occurred in 1900. The dissolution itself is not mentioned in the report of the Goethe-Gesellschaft. Despite the great disagreement with Manchester, the remainder of the English Goethe Society agreed to broaden its scope, and the statuses were amended with effect from 1891 to read. While always keeping Goethe as the central figure, the attention of the members might also be directed to other fields of German literature, art, and science. So, for example, members could listen to a presentation about Heinrich Heine or a lecture on Röntgen rays or X-rays, which had been introduced to the general public just 2 years before in a publication by Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen. The wider range of topics and the revival of meetings met with growing interest among the membership, and Oswald reported that even some members who had been wavering in the preceding period of slackening came forth in declaring that the new committee were putting new life into the society. End of quote. I would like to take this opportunity to address the loose ends from the beginning and to highlight the enormous impact of the Oswald family on the English Goethe Society. As you've already heard, Eugene Oswald was the Society's secretary over a very long period. In addition, he played a crucial role in saving the English Goethe Society during their crisis in 1891 as a member of the executive committee. Around 1905, when his health started to decline, his daughter Lina started to support him with the day-to-day business. After his death in 1912, she herself took on the role as the secretary. During World War II, the archive of the English Goethe Society was destroyed by German bombs. So the material which is available today came mostly from the Oswald's family heritage. As secretaries, Eugene and Lina Oswald owned many copies copies of the writings as well as the annual reports. So, as a last point, I would like to mention a curious incident that took place shortly before the outbreak of World War I. Through a very generous donation by a female member of the society, they were able to establish a fund, which was renamed as Oswald Memorial Scholarship after Eugene Oswald's death. The scholarship was intended as a travel grant for a research stay in the German Empire. A good idea, but one that had dire consequences. I quote, "In due course, a scholar was elected and he proceeded to Germany in July 1914. But instead of having a pleasant and profitable time in the Goethe archives of Weimar and Frankfurt, he had to spend a year or more behind the wire fences of a war prisoners' camp." End of quote. The whole story becomes even more bizarre when you consider the topic he had chosen. I quote, "He was to have written on English visitors to Germany in Goethe's time and the hospitality they received." End of quote. So the scholarship holder himself did unfortunately not benefit from this hospitality in the grip of the First World War. My research ends with the outbreak of World War I. Shortly before and of course during the war, all activities were suspended as belonging to a society which was devoted itself to German literature was very much resented and could even be dangerous. The English Goethe Society resumed its meeting in 1923. So I hope you enjoyed this small glimpse into the formation of the English Goethe Society. Thank you very much for your attentions and congratulations to your 135th anniversary. Thank you. I can't hear you. I'm sorry. I think you're
Jim, you have to unmute.
I've done it. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Fabienne, for that lovely talk. Your researches really came together very coherently and gave us a wonderful picture of the early days of the society, and ending with that nice anecdote about the hospitality that one hoped for and didn't receive is a humorous touch to a lecture, which I think must also owe something to your work in English culture. Thank you very much. And do we need a break before we start on to Dan's paper, or can we go simply straight on? Dan, are you happy just to pick up the threads and continue straight away? And any questions, I think, can be asked at a later stage.
That's fine with me.
Okay. Right.
Okay, thanks very much. It was very interesting to hear Fabienne talk about the hospitality, but also the conviviality that was in the early days of the EGS, because in fact, the original plan for this day was to have a dinner in the evening, which is why the symposium is in the afternoon, but we decided not to change the time because it would just create more confusion. So I'm going to share my screen, see if this works. Trying to get it as a I have to get rid of the taskbar, it looks like.
I note that you have a different title now, Dan, from the one printed in the...
That's right. Yep. Yeah. At the moment, I'm trying to get to the...
if you go into slideshow,
there it is.
Okay. Down, and then from beginning, right over on the left.
All right.
Should do it.
So yes, it is a slightly different title, and I won't deal with the whole period that I intended to from 1923 when the society was reconstituted after the First World War. That's simply because I had too much material for the sort of core of the paper, which has to do with the period 1933 to 1945. And let me say from the beginning, I'll mention some of the scholars that I've benefited from, but two that I won't mention are Ulrich Tidau from UCL, who's in the audience, who knows a lot about Hans Friedrich Blunk, who I'll introduce you to, but also especially Andrea Maya Ludovisi from the archivist at Senate House, who knows the materials extremely well, and a lot of the documents I would not know about without her. So thumbing through the publications of the English Goethe Society in the years 1933 to 1939 gives the impression that the editor and indeed the society were critical of the Nazi regime from the beginning. And this view is not entirely wrong. The Society's program of lectures, many of which were published in its journal, benefited greatly from dissident and Jewish scholars and writers who had fled Nazi Germany, some of whom settled in Britain either temporarily or permanently. Among the speakers were the literary sociologist Ernst Cohn-Bramstedt, who took, oh, I'm sorry, these are my sources, aren't they? I'll just skip over that. Who later called himself Ernest Cohn-Bramstedt, the philosopher Ernst Cassirer, and the literary scholars Richard Alevin, Richard Samuel, and Walter Berenson. If this list doesn't look very long to you, you have to remember that the EGS only had one issue of PEGs every year. And so these were a large percentage of the articles. The expressionist writer Ernst Toller, too, read from his poems before the Society. To be sure, there was also room for a Nazi sympathizer, the Tübingen medievalist Hermann Schneider, as late as 1938. But judging from public evidence, the Society seems to have made an effort to give a platform to anti-Nazi refugees, particularly those who had settled in Britain, reflecting a general trend in British German studies that John Flood has traced. The PEG's editor was the honorary secretary of the EGS, Leonard Willoughby. He had succeeded J.G. Robertson in 1932. Willoughby was, since 1931, the Fielding Professor of German at University College London, and of course, a leading Goethe scholar who has rightly been called, quote, probably the most important figure in British Germanistic, unquote, during these years. In 1952, when he became the Society's president, in 1952, he became the Society's president. So in the years of Nazi rule in Germany, he essentially ran the Society and invited its speakers, possibly in collaboration with the president, George P. Gooch, but more likely with the senior vice president, Hermann Georg Fiedler, the Taylor Professor of German in Oxford, to whom I'll return later. I won't be talking about Gooch because his role is all but invisible. He just doesn't come up in the documents in this period. The archival evidence, though, unsettles the image of an entirely anti-Nazi English Goethe Society and exposes internal conflict in these questions. In October 1935, it turns out, the poet Hans Friedrich Blunk was invited to speak to the EGS, doubtless on Willoughby's invitation, something that did not appear in the Society's regular chronicle. Blunk had been president of the Reichsschrifttumskammer, a creation of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. At the EGS event, Blunk read from his literary works. But a week earlier, he had said in another speech in London, oft werde ich, wenn ich von diesen Dingen spreche, im Ausland gefragt, wenn wirklich eine so große neue Macht über euch kam, wenn ein solcher Ruf zu neuer Dichtung und Schöpfung über Deutschland hallt, warum zwängt dann eure Regierung das Schrifttum ein und versucht, ihm den Mund zu verbieten? Wir in Deutschland können über die Frage nur lächeln. Es sind eine ganze Reihe von Büchern und Schriften unterdrückt worden, aber nur weil in ihnen jener Geist des Verfalls und der Zersetzung lebte, der nicht nur auf politischem Felde niedergerungen werden musste, wenn Deutschland leben sollte. Das echte dichterische Schaffen aber ist im Dritten Reich so frei wie nie zuvor. So this is not his speech, his reading from his literary works before the English Goethe Society, but a week earlier, a London speech. What Blunk avoids mentioning to his British audience is that most of these banned authors, supposedly possessed by the spirit of decline and decay, were Jewish. In his post-war memoirs, Blunk paints his English Goethe Society reading as a huge success, allegedly a spontaneous follow-on to a reading for students the same day. Welch dankbare Hörer! Die Studenten und ihr prächtiger Lehrer Willoughby verlangten sofortige Wiederholung der Lesung. Am Abend tagte die Goethe-Gesellschaft. Welche vorzügliche Gelegenheit! So as if it had sort of happened spontaneously. 2 days later, on October 24th, 1935, Willoughby wrote to the EGS secretary, Ella Oswald. I thought that she was named, I always have seen her name as Ella, not Lena, but in any case, she might have changed her name in the meantime. He writes to her, I thought the Blunk-Abend a success, although Dr. Rose attacked it on political grounds, exclamation mark. This is at the bottom of the handwritten page. Have you had any criticisms? William Rose is shown here in a photo from Bletchley Park, where he worked in the code-breaking project during the war. But at this time, he was Ernest, at that time as well, actually, he was Ernest Cassel Reader at the London School of Economics. He was a Jewish Germanist who was a pioneer of psychoanalytic interpretation and whose research focused partly on Jewish expressionist and generally progressive writers, as well as the classical writers. He was also a member of the EGS Council, which gave his attack, his objection to Blunk's appearance, added weight. Ella Oswald's response to Willoughby's letter is unfortunately not extant. You heard about the large part of the archive having been destroyed in 1940. But she must have asked about the reasons for Rose's attack on the Blunk event, because 4 days later, Willoughby responds. So we only have his letters, which were in her possession. Quote, Dr. Rose's objections to Blunk were not to what he said, Rose wasn't present at the meeting, but to his having been asked at all, because as president of the Reichsschriftumskammer, he had taken action to deprive Jewish authors of their means of livelihood by excluding them from membership of the Kammer. Now, what interests me, to go back to this screen, is the exclamation mark. It and the word attacked seem to indicate Willoughby's surprise or even, indeed anger at Rose's criticism for even inviting Blunk. To be sure, there may be other reasons for this formulation. In an apparent paradox, in both of the letters cited, Willoughby finalizes arrangements for the lecture of Richard Alevin for the EGS, and you can see that at the top of this page. Alevin had a Jewish grandmother and had fled to Austria. So Willoughby may have been chagrined that Rose did not appreciate the Society's support of Jewish lecturers. It may be that Willoughby was puzzled by Rose's objection to a literary reading, as opposed to, it was not a political speech. But there could be other reasons for Willoughby's exclamation mark. For one, both Willoughby and Rose had had good relations with Blunk since the 1920s. And in the case of Rose, the friendship seems to have been firmer. Blunk, at least, referred to Rose and his wife as friends and made a point of visiting them whenever he was in London. So Willoughby may simply have been expressing surprise and annoyance that Rose would boycott the lecture of a mutual friend. That, however, is surprising in itself. Can he have expected that Rose would not criticize Blunk, given Blunk's complicity in anti-Jewish measures? Another explanation might be Blunk's ambiguous role as president of the Reichsschriftumskammer. For only 3 weeks before the lecture was given in London, Blunk had been dismissed from this role. He describes himself in his 1952 memoirs as an unwilling collaborator with the regime and critical of its persecution of Jews in particular. As has been pointed out by historians, Blunk's self-serving memoirs falsify much that can be verified from documentary evidence. At most, Jan Babian remarks, Blunk's, quote, Parteilosigkeit und seine lavierende Haltung in der Frage der jüdischen Kammermitglieder were what led to his downfall. And since the Gestapo had been involved in denouncing him to Goebbels, Blunk may have had an easy time of convincing Willoughby that he was something of a dissident, as he portrays himself after the war. But Willoughby would have had to be quite ignorant of what had happened under Blunk's leadership to believe his testimony, and indeed ignorant of the reports of Blunk's political speech in London a week earlier. 2 months before Blunk's reading for the EGS, Willoughby could have read in a long article in the Times, quote, signs of a revival of anti-Jewish activity have been reported. The Reich Chamber of Writing or Literature recently informed several thousands of Jewish writers that they were not fit to write or publish books in National Socialist Germany. Compare this with Blunk's own claim in the early 1950s that during his tenure as president, quote, no one was excluded because of race or opinion. This is probably what he told Willoughby in 1935, too. Rose, by contrast, would not have been taken in by Blunk's assertions, even if he had spoken with him on this occasion. Their friendship was already at an end. The last letter from Blunk in Rose's papers dates from late September 1933, 3 months after the Prussian Academy of Arts had purged its Jewish members and Blunk had been made deputy chair of the literary section. And Blunk sends along to Rose a report that he had published in the BBC journal, The Listener, about the euphemistically named reorganization, Umbildung, of the Prussian Academy. The German original of Blunk's article, which is what he sends, contains the usual Nazi broadsides against liberalismus and its intellectualism, snobbery, and laissez-faire attitude. Hitler is called a Sozialist who chose a constitutional path and compares it to the Roman consuls. Blunk paints the resulting National Socialist revolution in the most glowing terms. He denies that party affiliation had anything to do with the new nominations for members, entirely forgetting to mention that these places in the academy had been freed up by expelling Jewish and leftist writers. So this is a letter from September 1933, actually just before he had been appointed, Blunk had been appointed president of the Reichsschriftumskammer. After receiving this letter from Blunk with the speech, Rose must not have replied because there are no more letters from Blunk to his friend. Rose knew what Blunk's Reichsschriftumskammer was all about. He had himself written in 1934, or wrote the next year, 1934, exactly what went on in the Kammer, and that Jewish members were excluded. Indeed, Rose kept a newspaper cutting from spring of 1935 entitled Hans Blunk's Change of Front, which reported that Blunk had taken a harder line on the Jewish question than he had seemed to earlier. Despite Blunk's dismissal as president, his damage to Jewish lives had already been done, and he continued even after he had relinquished the presidency to spout propaganda in Britain, as his London speech a week before the EGS reading shows. In the light of Blunk's pro-regime stance, it is of course difficult to fathom why Willoughby seems to have had little understanding of Rose's attack and boycott. But one thing I think we could say, that Willoughby cannot be called a committed anti-Semite, having not only supported Jewish scholars, as I said, but he had written favorably about many of them, for example, praising the Goethe biographer Friedrich Gundolf as, quote, a critical genius, and calling Ludwig Marcuse's book on Ludwig Börne brilliant, though Emil Ludwig comes in for some barbs from him. But he singles out his British colleague William Rose for 3 of his publications. On the other hand, Willoughby wrote some troubling things about National Socialism and sometimes Jews, beginning with a piece meant for the wider public, published in the Contemporary Review, which was edited by EGS President George Gooch in December 1933 under the title, The Romantic Background of Hitlerism. Sorry, these are things that I have not. Willoughby has a dig at, quote, the spirit of internationalism and pacifism fostered by the lost war and represented by the extravagant claims of the Jewish authors of Expressionism to turn literature into socialist and pacifist propaganda. And he compares that to the romantic turn against, quote, foreign elements in German culture, namely rationalism or enlightenment. Though Willoughby expresses obvious fascination with Romanticism, he ultimately seems to emerge from the darkness. Quote, in the emphasis on the national aspects of its literature, modern Germany has turned away from the great European movement of humanitarian culture, of which first Lessing and then Goethe were the supreme representatives in Germany. And here Willoughby stresses Lessing's friendship with Moses Mendelssohn. However, he lays out with some empathy the German attitude. To our older, more stable Western civilization, the mental attitude of modern Germany may savor of arrogance, of megalomania and aggressiveness. To the Germans, it is an article of faith, a religious conviction, a spiritual awakening, a return to ideal values after the materialism of the post-war years. In the end, however, Willoughby comes down on the side of, quote, the Christian virtues of charity and humility, of gentleness and tolerance, who rejects force, he's talking about the gentleman, who rejects force as an answer to conviction and abhors brutality and cruelty as the basest and most savage of human passions. In closing with this rallying call, Willoughby, this is the end of the piece. Willoughby begins to get at the true nature of Hitler's movement, though in the entire intellectual exercise, he lends it the historical pedigree that it desperately sought. In the sweeping statement, quote, National Socialism is nothing more nor less than romantic socialism, earlier in the piece. The difficulty of ascertaining Willoughby's own position in this article, his, if you will, his lavieren, going back and forth, is the stamp of his strategy, later more explicit, to present a balanced, fair assessment of Germany under Nazi rule. After that December 1933 article, Willoughby gave an April 1934 lecture to the English Goethe Society commemorating the centenary of Coleridge's death, held at King's College, London, under the unauspicious title, Coleridge and His German Contemporaries, where he provides a variation on his earlier thesis. Willoughby closes by addressing the curious affinities of Coleridge with the political and social beliefs of Hitlerism. And he suggests, through Carlyle, as is well known, they, that is these affinities, found their way back into Germany. Carlyle's hero is one of the ancestors of Nietzsche's Superman, and his hero worship is at the back of the National Socialist principle of leadership, an idea which, given the scholarship to which he refers in a footnote, must have been a known scholarly assumption. Here we see Willoughby coming perilously close to the line between scholarship and legitimation of Nazism in an EGS lecture. Later, as we'll see, he crossed that line. Now, so this is in 1934, April 1934. As we follow the chronology, Rose's boycott of Blunk's reading for the EGS was in October 1935, a year and a half after this presentation. Willoughby's attitude, even indeed his invitation to Blunk, must be seen in the light of developments in Germany and the regime's relations to Britain. Many Germans and foreigners eagerly grasped at Hitler's professions that he wanted peace, an illusion for which the years 1933 to 36 were fertile. In June 1935, most importantly, Britain concluded the crucial naval agreement with Hitler, which allowed him to expand his naval forces to a third of the size of the British fleet. It was an important milestone in the policy of appeasement of Hitler. It also represented a further degradation of the Versailles Treaty's limits on German military expansion, and it was agreed without consulting France, and indeed represented an attempt on Hitler's part to drive a wedge between France and Britain, with whom he sought a separate alliance right until his death. His focus was always on keeping Britain out of the war with a separate peace. However, in 1935, it seemed the naval agreement seemed to signal a relaxation of tensions and fed hopes for peace. And in this atmosphere, efforts to improve British understanding of Germany seemed to help stave off war. Enter the English Goethe Society. 2 months after the naval agreement, the Weimar Goethe-Gesellschaft celebrated its 50th anniversary and the opening of an expanded Goethe Nationalmuseum in the days around Goethe's birthday in August 1935. It was a festive event to which the regime luminaries and foreign dignitaries were invited. Britain was represented by the vice president of the English Goethe Society, Hermann Georg Fiedler. Oh, sorry. This is the statue in the Taylor Institution in Oxford. He was a native German and robust despite his 73 years. Fiedler was more a cultural emissary and a political mover and shaker than a scholar. Among other roles, he was the private tutor to the young Prince of Wales. So we see the connection with the royal family from before, who was to ascend to the throne as Edward VIII half a year after the celebrations in Weimar. Just to set the setting from August 1935, this is where Fiedler was speaking, and this is not when he was speaking though. You can see him here in the front row, and incidentally over here is R.A. Williams, the Schroeder professor in Cambridge. We know this from the seating chart that accompanied and that's in the archive. Now, his speech, Fiedler's speech, representing Britain at this event, was kurz aber packend. It's a very short speech. It's only a page and a half, double-spaced, typewritten, was interrupted by more times by audience applause than any other speech given among many, as the stenographer's version shows, especially when he stressed British-German ties. Und dann betrachten wir es unsere vornehmste und schönste Aufgabe, den Engländern Goethes Leben und Dichten zu deuten und dadurch ihr Verständnis für deutsches Wesen überhaupt. And there we have lebhafter Beifall. So die beiden großen Völker einander näher zu bringen in gegenseitigem Verstehen und in gegenseitiger Achtung. More Beifall. Diese Aufgabe, this is the end of the speech, wird uns erleichtert durch die tiefgehende und tief begründete Wesensverwandtschaft der beiden Völker. This topic comes up again and again, as we'll see. Ich lebe in dem frohen Glauben, dass trotz allem, was in den letzten 20 Jahren geschehen ist, die Besten der Nation hier wie drüben einander geistig nicht entfremdet worden sind. Beifall. And then he has a couple of verses that he must have written himself. Was Deutschland und England zu trennen auch scheint, hier Shakespeare, dort Goethe, hält sie vereint. And then you have lebhafter, lange anhaltender Beifall. Again, much more than you have in any of the other, registered for any of the other speeches. What Fiedler offers his enthusiastic German audience is British understanding and respect and recognition of an icon of German culture as, that is Goethe, as the vehicle of Anglo-German rapprochement. Fiedler's speech may have been built on hopes for peace and international understanding, but it also had the effect of lending legitimacy to the Nazi regime and playing into Hitler's strategy of achieving an alliance with Britain. Later, at the 50th anniversary celebrating the founding of the EGS in February 1936, so half a year after this, mere weeks after his Germanophile former pupil had descended to the throne, Fiedler described the English Goethe Society's efforts, quote, to mediate between the mind of England and the mind of Germany at a time when other and more powerful influences tend to draw apart old friends and near kinfolk. The sort of connection between Britain and between England and Germany is again and again referred to in many documents from this period as a racial one. In the meantime, though, promoting Anglo-German friendship was becoming more fraught, relaxed only briefly during the Berlin Olympic Games of 1936. Willoughby doubtless had the same goal of strengthening these ties when he invited Blunk to speak before the English Goethe Society in 1935, less than 2 months after Fiedler's evocation of Goethe and Shakespeare as the guarantors of détente in his Weimar speech. Blunk himself was a lifelong champion of Anglo-German cooperation. There was, however, a major difference between Blunk and the other 3 major writers with whom Willoughby and both Willoughby and Fiedler promoted. First of all, there's the Austrian writer Erwin Guido Kolbenheyer, whom the Nazis elevated as their most celebrated writer, but who was widely respected before 1933. Willoughby himself mentions his work approvingly in 1931. The second is Hans Grimm, one of the leading cultural voices of nationalism and folkish thought, who was a Nazi sympathizer from the early 1920s, but ended up in conflict with Goebbels. And the third is Rudolf Binding, famous for his World War I writing. What Kolbenheyer, Grimm, and Binding have in common is that they came from privileged bourgeois backgrounds. They had nationalistic, racist, and anti-Jewish views, but avoided joining the Nazi Party, though they generally supported National Socialist tenets, especially Kolbenheier and Grimm, even before 1933. All were highly respected and popular writers before 1933, despite their views that today seem so repugnant. And Kolbenheier and Grimm had strong ties to Britain. Perhaps most importantly, Fiedler and Willoughby knew these authors personally before 1933. Blunk, too, was well known as a conservative writer before 1933. He was also a friend of Britain and indeed of Willoughby and Rose. However, Blunk had thrown in his lot, supposedly reluctantly, with the regime, and despite misgivings of the persecution of Jews. So in this way, he differs from the other three writers. One would hope after Rose's intervention on October 1935, Blunk disappears from our story until after the war, whereas the others do not. One would hope that is because Willoughby got the message that it was a mistake to invite Blunk to read before the Society, especially soon after he had given a propaganda speech in London. Willoughby had to develop another vehicle for his agenda of promoting understanding of Nazi Germany. This was the journal German Life and Letters, inaugurated in 1936. The year 1936 saw heightened activity on behalf of Anglo-German ties among our EGS protagonists. Fiedler sought to introduce contemporary German writers to his colleagues and students in the Oxford University German Literary Society, and he invited both Grimm and Kolbenheier. Fiedler wrote with pride to Petersen in 1936. This is, by the way, a card that Kolbenheier sent to August Kloss, Christmas 1938. This seems to be, Kloss has three of these from Kolbenheier in different years. They seem to be the way he in lieu of a Christmas card every year. So Fiedler wrote with pride to Julius Petersen, the president of the Goethe Gesellschaft in Berlin, quote, am 27. Januar wird Kolbenheier in unserer deutschen Gesellschaft hier vorlesen. That is the German Literary Society. In the later report on Kolbenheier's lecture in Oxford, we read that the German novel had, quote, an indispensable connection with folk biological experience, an expression of folkish views that sustained Nazi ideology and excluded Jews from the true folk. Notice, though, the sort of scare quotations there. Like Fiedler, Willoughby continued to promote British understanding for Germany. Indeed, it is likely that Fiedler's views on Anglo-German understanding, as expressed in the Weimar speech and widely reported in the German press, gave key impetus to Willoughby's founding of German Life and Letters in autumn 1936. And Kolbenheier's Oxford paper for Fiedler had already been delivered at UCL on Willoughby's invitation. Already in that issue of the first issue of German Life and Letters, Willoughby reports on EGS activities and concludes very much in Fiedler's vein, quote, the English Goethe Society is proud to have united the English and Germans in a great fellowship of letters under the name of Goethe. But here an unpleasant episode intervenes. Around this time, Willoughby sought out a German audience for his views on the progeny of National Socialism. And it is here that he crossed the line between promoting Anglo-German understanding and lending support to the regime. Willoughby published a shorter version of his 1934 PEGS article on Coleridge in the respected Germanisch-Romanische Monatsschrift under the title Coleridge und die Deutschen. But whereas in PEGS, Willoughby had described very briefly, quote, the curious affinities of Coleridge with the political and social beliefs of Hitlerism, now he juices up his message to suit a German and indeed Nazi audience. Toward the end of the essay, he lets all caution fly. Quoting Coleridge, so all of these quotes here are from Coleridge. Maybe I will skip over most of this, but these are all sort of things that feed into, Willoughby calls it den Geist des Führertums, and so forth. But maybe I'll skip to the end of it, where he says, Willoughby says, würde Coleridge heute leben, so würde sich fraglos zu manchen grundlegenden Anschauungen des Nationalsozialismus bekennen. Selbst bis hin zu dem Punkt theoretischer, I like this word, theoretischer Antipathie gegenüber den Juden als den außerhalb des Staates stehenden und mit dem deutschen Philosophen Jacobi bis zur Ablehnung der Toleranz. Quote from Jacobi, keiner von uns ist in dem, was ihn tief und lebhaft bewegt, tolerant, behauptet er. He repeats his earlier argument that Coleridge's supposedly proto-fascist ideas had an impact in Germany via Carlyle and Nietzsche. And he concludes, Carlyles Held ist der unmittelbare Vorfahre von Nietzsches Übermensch und seine Heldenverehrung steht hinter dem nationalsozialistischen Grundsatz des Führertums. Seine politischen Theorien sind denen der heutigen Herrscher in Deutschland ebenso verwandt wie denen des Zweiten Reiches, als Bismarck ihn mit dem Pour le Mérite auszeichnete. The article ends, wenn also, wie so oft gegen ihn angeführt worden ist, Coleridge oft übermäßig von deutschen Quellen borgte, so wird zugegeben, dass er seine Schuld großmütigst und mit Zinseszins zurückzahlte. He's paying the Germans back most generously. This, I would say, this article is certainly the worst, probably at least, the worst thing that Willoughby ever wrote. He gives no hint of distancing himself from these ideas or even from a sense of the historical disparity of Coleridge's or Carlyle's time and Hitler's. The hair-raising claim that that Coleridge would approve of much in Nazi Germany goes well beyond what Willoughby had claimed in the Peg's article and gives sustenance and respectability to National Socialism, in particular from an apparently scholarly voice from abroad that also seems to confirm National Socialist notions of the racial bond between England and Germany, what Fiedler had referred to as near kinfolk, and thus to legitimize Hitler's foreign policy aims. It was perhaps, what are we doing for time? How long have I been? It was perhaps not a propitious moment for Willoughby to found his new periodical, German Life and Letters. Here, he not only expanded the scope of German studies, that has to be said, but also explicitly sought to overcome sharp political differences in British judgments of Nazi Germany. History has judged him harshly. Wolfgang Brenn has argued that Willoughby was, quote, naively optimistic, if not wrong-headed, and that the whole enterprise, started after the Berlin Olympics, was founded on a striking misjudgment, end of quote. Charmian Brinson, who is with us today, in a more detailed analysis of the periodical, says that Willoughby pursued, quote, a sort of crude even-handedness. In October 1937, for example, a piece taking issue with recent dismissals on racial and political grounds of university teachers in Germany preceded an expression of the journal's heartiest congratulations to the Nazi sympathizer Rudolf Binding on the attainment of his 70th birthday. And what did Willoughby write of Binding? He was the first to rise up in eloquent defense of the spiritual values of the new Germany, that is Nazi Germany, against the accusations of Romain Rolland, though he is not and never has been a member of the National Socialist Party, that is Binding has not been. He is free from any suggestion of aggressiveness or superiority of race or creed. And then in parentheses, did he not, as a staff officer during the war, against all the tradition of the Prussian army, enforce the granting of commissioned rank to a Jew? And this is a true story. I'm not going to quote all of what Binding wrote in his defense of Nazi Germany to Roland Roland. But what he says is, at the end, sorry, at the second to last line, he admits everything that Roland says, even the measures against Jews, and he calls them Randerscheinungen. I'm going to skip some here. The anonymous author of the 1977 Peg's obituary of Willoughby says of his founding of GLL, the German Life and Letters, quote, in a time when public opinion was sensitive about things German, he was able to ensure that his journal conveyed his own stance, one of sharp-eyed but not starry-eyed affection toward Germany. More clear-eyed, also in hindsight, of course, is the anonymous Times obituary in 1977. The project of German Life and Letters was, quote, almost doomed to disaster. Willoughby's harmonizing efforts went so far as to publish essays by Kolbenheier and Grimm, as I've said. And there is this, in Kolbenheier, this talk of, he always talks about biology and race. Grimm argues for the racial bond between the Germanic English people and the Germans and their common interests, or at least the interest of the privileged class, struggling against mass culture, what he calls, quote, the qualitative superiority of white men. To be sure, Kolbenheier's and Grimm's essays in German Life and Letters avoided open propaganda and blatant anti-Semitism. But precisely this veneer of scholarly soberness will have given British readers a warped image of these pro-Nazi writers and lent them and the regime undeserved prestige. It should be pointed out, however, that with other articles, Willoughby, as editor, did not ignore the plight of Jews as part of his effort at fairness and balance. By 1938, moreover, particularly after the so-called Anschluss of his beloved Austria, where he had studied in March, Willoughby had recognized that his project had failed, as Brinson has shown. He even criticized a piece by his friend Hans Grimm. These events are relevant to the English Goethe Society, not least because Willoughby essentially led it. As I pointed out, Willoughby gave exiled scholars, particularly Jewish ones, a platform in lectures and essays. Willoughby apparently viewed the opposite invitation to a figure like Blunk as an effort at fairness and balance. His calculation was that Blunk's propaganda speech a week earlier was irrelevant to his English Goethe Society reading from his literary works. But Rose, William Rose, saw it differently. It was the person that mattered, the former Nazi official, not the content of his EGS appearance. As a Jewish Englishman, he was sensitive to the politics behind the man more than Willoughby was. My thesis is that Rose's 1935 boycott, if you will, put an end to Willoughby deploying the EGS to seek such a balance, and that Willoughby founded German Life and Letters the next year for this purpose. So he split them off. Willoughby's own 1934 article in Pegs, pointing out the, quote, curious affinities of Coleridge with the political and social beliefs of Hitlerism, was a one-off in Pegs. He radicalized that message in his article for a German audience 2 years later, after Rose's intervention against Rose's intervention against Blunk's invitation, but kept pegs generally free of such questionable political discourse. I think I will actually end there because the time seems to be marching on, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, well, I'm sure there's a lot more material as you imply, and there's plenty already that you've presented us with. Now, we can look back on 3 presentations, and if there are questions, then we can take them now. And I think Kevin is going to take over as host for this part of the proceedings.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to the speakers. Just a word of explanation why I would be grateful if you would put your questions in the chat function. There's one legal reason for this. This session is being recorded, and if we were to have you asking your questions directly, apparently we would have had to gain your consent to being recorded, and this would have been quite an effort. So, and it seems that we can work around this quite simply by using the chat function. You can address your chat. I think you can address it just to everyone, and then everyone can see the question. Or if you want, you can address it simply to me, and then I will relay it. So whichever you wish to do, the floor is now open to questions to any of our 3 or all of our 3 speakers.
Well, I would like to ask Dan whether Willoughby ever reflected critically on his own position in any kind of later memoir or apologia. I mean, looking back on events, it must have been clear to him that his involvement, this kind of semi-apologetic involvement, must have gone quite a long way. And in the mood of later politics and looking back on Nazism, is there no sign that he ever, as it were, came to terms with his own past?
There are some lectures, some sort of autobiographical lectures in his papers, handwritten lecture notes, and he doesn't deal with it in those. And he also, I left this out for reasons of length. In 1952, he published a review in German Life and Letters of Blunk's autobiography, which, as I mentioned before, was he was really sort of whitewashing himself, and he really kind of swallowed a lot of what Blunk said. And after that, a Jewish emigre from Vienna, I believe, Jonas Lesser, wrote to Willoughby and pointed out to him quite a few things that Blunk had said during the Nazi years, the period when he was president of the Reichsschriftumskammer. There's no response extant from Willoughby, but it does seem to be that he may have been unaware of much of the things that Lesser sent to him. There's one other thing I should mention. In the year before, I think, 1951, in German Life and Letters, he published an essay from an American scholar that was very critical of a piece that Hans Grimm had written, responding to a speech a radio address by the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's a very infamous thing called the Erzbischofsschrift. And so this scholar, who was probably also, he was a refugee from Germany and probably Jewish, kind of unmasks Hans Grimm's mistakes and his attitude there, where he really seems to justify the Holocaust as well. And Willoughby remarks on the article in the Chronicle and says that he publishes it at the, that it's important to have at the risk of losing a close acquaintance, that is his acquaintance Hans Grimm. But that's really kind of the closest he comes, except that, as I said, in 1938, from 1938, he did recognize that he had failed in his effort, especially after the Anschluss in March 1938. And, there were critical articles in German Life and Letters, as I mentioned. But it really was a kind of, in hindsight, of course, it's very easy to say that it was a massive mistake. And I think you have to, I won't defend by any means everything that Willoughby wrote, but you have to realize that people were trying to avoid the kind of awful war that they had all gone through. And I think Willoughby fought in the war, as did Rose in the First World War. And this, building bridges between Germany and Britain seemed to be the only way that they could go about it. Most people, of course, were not doing much, and he took a big risk in doing so when Willoughby, and admitted that he had failed, essentially.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah. Good. We have a question from Ellen Pillsworth. First of all, she'd like to see the slide again about the newspaper article about banning Jews from the Kammer. So you might see if you can call that up again.
So the one by William Rose?
I'm afraid I don't have any further details about what slide was meant. Oh, the one that it got skipped. Ellen says it was skipped.
Oh, okay. Okay. Whoops. Wait a minute. What's going on here? I think this must be, is this the one, Ellen?
Oh, Ellen thinks it was from the Times.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I did quote it, but.
Okay, I'll just leave it there for Ellen to study, but she also has a question to you, Dan. What were Willoughby's views within the spectrum of British politics? What were his views about British politics? Where did he stand?
I really would have to pass on that. I don't know. I would have to speculate that he supported Neville Chamberlain's line of appeasement, and of course, until 1937, I think Chamberlain was his tenure was at an end in 1937. But Chamberlain is another good example of how far, how you can go across the line in this respect, because in at least one press conference, when material was presented, he was confronted with persecution of Jews in Germany. He called it Jewish communist propaganda. So he, in order to achieve some sort of settlement with Germany, he was willing to overlook or play down the worst aspects of the regime. But I don't know is my answer.
We don't know how Willoughby voted anyway. Okay, good. There was a comment by Angus, which I think everyone can see, so I will pass that over. We have a question from Ray Conker. to Dan again about Willoughby's even-handedness. Do you have any sense of how the post-war Soviet occupation zone, Besatzungszone, or later DDR, how that was treated in?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last, in what? Sorry, I didn't hear the end of your sentence. I imagine you are asking about in German Life and Letters. And I have to say, I'm not familiar with that either. I didn't really cover that. So
Kevin seems to have an internet problem.
can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, did you hear what I said in response to that?
Yes, we did, but Kevin has lost contact.
Okay, all right. I can see this chat. I suppose I could. Oh,
Kevin, you're muted. Kevin, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. I lost my internet connection for some reason there. I do apologize. Where were we? We were on the chat. Had I already managed to phrase Ellen, to pass on Ellen's question or not?
I think so. We lost you after the word in, and I think it was in German Life and Letters, but I don't know.
Yes, well, what was the view in either German Life and Letters or PEGs or both about East Germany and in relation to the Cold War? What line did the two journals take?
I mean, the only thing I recall is sort of some pretty sharp comments about in the immediate post-war period up to 1949, in particular the Goethe events in 1949, where the the exploitation of Goethe by the GDR was pointed out. I believe in German Life and Letters.
Right, good.
But I don't know about after that.
Now I'm going to interrupt the questions from the chat because they're all, at the moment, they're all to Dan, but I would just like to bring in Angus and Fabian, if I may, before we move on to the next question in the chat. Really a question to Angus. So Müller's views on the Hindus, and all in connection with these theories about the Aryan race and so forth. How did Müller square that with what I believe were Goethe's rather disparaging views of Indian religion, precisely compared to Islam, of which he took a more favorable view? Was there any? Did Müller try to deal with that, or was he just happy to let that rest auf sich beruhen?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll put the key term in the chat because it's a weird term that you don't often hear. I think Schelling and Max Müller are the only two people to have used it. Henotheism. So from what I recall of Goethe's antipathy towards Hinduism, and I think I recall this from the Noten to the Divan, he's disoriented by the proliferation of gods and associates polytheistic beliefs with a kind of primitivism. And what Max Müller was concerned to do, as I tried to show in my paper, is to argue that, so he has this physical concept of religion. Religion is a physical urge that human beings had when they first saw the sun arise. And then in this essay on comparative mythology, he shows that the root of the word for the sun, or to shine, is the same in Sanskrit as it is in ancient Greek. And from that, he concludes that actually the so-called ancient Aryans were originally a single people with a single religion. And so then his problem is, what's the relationship between Christianity and Hinduism today? And it's through henotheism, this idea that actually polytheism is really just veiled monotheism. So the many gods are just a manifestation of a single god, which is superior. A little bit like how in the Greek pantheon, Zeus is seen as superior, and the other gods are kind of subordinate. Müller argued that, in fact, Hinduism is a monotheistic religion. And for that reason, he didn't want to go to India. He was the expert on India, but he actually never went there. And he wrote in a letter, I don't want to go there because my image of India is based on the Vedas and I don't want that particular image destroyed. So he was very keen on this Verwandtschaft. And relating to Dan's paper, I mean, of course, we can't draw a line to this, to these remarks that Dan quoted, but this idea that there's a kind of inner relation between the British and the German people was very strong in the 19th century. And the person who I mentioned in the chat, Edward Augustus Freeman, who wrote this book called Comparative Politics, which is a quote of Max Muller's Comparative Mythology, basically said that the British and the Germans are both Aryan in terms of their racial characteristics, and they have this Teutonic world-leading tendency which unites them. So it was a pretty old idea. I don't think that Max Müller was responsible for this political deployment of it, but he certainly was part of the atmosphere that allowed that type of argument to develop.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ram. I'll resume the thread of the chat, but only to say to Fabienne how much I enjoyed the paper, and I was electrified to hear that there were lectures on Röntgenstrahlen to the English Goethe Society. So members of the English Goethe Society, stand by for advanced lectures on nuclear physics coming up shortly in your program. I think we need to widen our scope considerably to match our ancestors. So thank you for that prompt.
Can I also say, Kevin, just briefly, I mean, based on Fabienne's research, Eugen or Eugene Oswald is in many ways the hero of our society. So yes. maybe we should.
He saved it. Yes, he
maybe
saved
in some way we should commemorate him as well. But I think that's another question.
We would not be here without Oswald. It's quite clear from what you said. Absolutely, yes, very good. Now we have a question from Clark Munzer. It is in your general chat, but I'll just repeat it. Is Dan aware of any documentation that would allow the inclusion of Mary Wilkinson in this story, either as a young scholar or at the time or retrospectively? And Jeremy Adler is already signaling something, I think, but we'll ask Dan to contribute, and then Jeremy might want to comment.
Well, she was, of course, what was she, 15 years younger than he and his student. I mean, she only, as far as I know, her debut for the English Goethe Society was in 1945, the paper on Tasso. And Willoughby also in that year, in fact, I believe it was Willoughby who was speaking in the very last days of the war with his lecture, Horse and Charioteer in Goethe's Poetry. So those two works, in my view, they sort of kind of symbolize the direction of the society after that you're returning to a close reading of text in the post-war mode already in 1945. And I think it's clear that, the signal that's being set was, that they're setting the tone. But of course, already in 1935, I think, Willoughby had decided that the English Goethe Society was not the place for politics. So it's really just a matter of, it's two different journals, of course, that he was editing. Jeremy?
Yeah, I was very impressed and shocked by your contribution, Dan. Knowing Willoughby from another side, when my family came to Britain from the camps, he was extremely kind and sympathetic, and helped to find jobs and so on. But I'll answer I've got several points I'd like to ask you, but I'll just answer the specific one about Mary.
About what?
About Mary Wilkinson.
Oh, yeah.
Throughout the 60s, later 60s, when I was a pupil of hers, both undergraduate and postgraduate, she was insistent that British German studies should not be in fealty to German studies, and that it was not our duty to rehearse the ideas of German philosophy, German Germanistic, or German politics. And so she was quite furious with the Germanists who emigrated to California and continued to speak German. And she said this was quite out of order. You had to speak in the language of the country that you inhabited, and you had to teach in that language. That was the only way that you could honestly bring something truthful to your subject. So there was a complete rejection of Willoughby's, I must say, I think, very naive on the left hand, on the right hand kind of politics. Now, I didn't know at the time that she was getting at her former master and lover, but it would seem to me that what she said was a pretty clear rejection of his stance.
But of course, I mean, you have to remember that in the 1930s, he was at the same time helping emigre scholars, you know, and giving them a platform as well. As you know, that letter where he has Alevin and Blunk in the same letter is just sort of mind-boggling to me, but that's what he was doing.
It was actually far more widespread in British Germanistic. He wasn't, you present him as a loner, but Kloss did exactly the same. He's got this anthology of German poetry, and if he puts someone in from the left, he has to put someone in from the right. And it's
interesting,
with this muddled even-handedness of politically blind figures in our subject. Must be regretted.
I did mention the article by John Flood where that he has this sort of larger context.
This Kloss anthology is enormously popular, you see. It's very much the Willoughby sort of.
Thank you.
Good. Good. We have again, I think you can all see it in the chat, but another question from Ellen and for Fabienne or for anyone else who can answer the question. When did women first join the English Goethe Society? Right from the start or when? Anyone can answer. Fabienne?
I try to. So yeah, they joined from the very beginning. They often had, they participated in the events. So they did not have lectures in the very beginning. I'm kind of speculating. So I hope it's also, but they participated in a lot of events, especially in the branches. But there was also a female vice president. So it was Anna Swanwick. She was a translator of Faust. And I think she died before in 1899. So it was in the early years already that there was a female vice president. And
well, I think that puts us in the vanguard.
Yeah, and also, so like I said about the scholarship, that was also by a female member, by Miss Mont. Her name was Mont, I guess, her last name. So yeah, there were women and they were participating. And I also wanted to add that Ella Oswald, mentioned in Dan's contribution, was also a daughter of Eugene Oswald. So Lina and Ella, they were sisters.
Okay. That clarifies. That's very helpful.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mont was an industrialist. Is that right? The father was a major industrialist, I think, in this country. The name rings a bell, anyway.
Yes, and her name was Frida. I just found it. So it was Frida Mont.
Yep.
That was the woman who contributed to the scholarship.
Yeah.
One of the people from that, one of the men from that family, I'm not sure which it was a council member in the 1930s. Oh, sorry, no, a vice president, one of the vice presidents. There were 5 vice presidents at that time. And I guess a different Mont was one of them.
Mm-hmm. It's alarming to learn how long they served. This is not a precedent that some of us are intending to follow. Any other questions? Not that I can see. So perhaps at this point I hand back to Jim.
Thank you very much for running that part, which you're technically competent to do in a way that I'm not, though I think I ought to learn somehow how to do it. Anyway, it's been a very satisfactory afternoon. I mean, it is fascinating to find out how much there is, but not surprising, to find how much there is that points in different directions other than Goethe, other than scholarship, political and social, and the whole intellectual background of periods that are remarkably different, though not very far away, remarkably different from our own. And we attempt to arrive at a sympathetic understanding of positions with which instinctively we are not sympathetic. It's been a very stimulating afternoon, so thank you very much to all speakers.
Good. Thank you again to the speakers. I will now simply bring the meeting, unless somebody objects and has some last minute thoughts they want to share, I will now simply bring the meeting to a close for everyone. So thank you all for joining.